Rosie, thanks for the introduction. I'm just going to stop my video and just because I'm slightly concerned about my poor internet connection. Okay, so I'm going to just putting up the ARCA website. Yeah, so I established ARCA in 2014. It stands for the Archive for Rural Contemporary Architecture. And I'm going to talk a bit about how the project came about, the collaboration with the designer and art director, Ben Mclaughlin. And I'm also going to talk about Slacklands 1 and also focus on Slacklands 2, which was a collaboration with Peter Nencini, who will then take over. So I was very interested in archiving and recording various rural buildings, and back in 2014 there was a lot of kind of conversations around droscapes. That's a term that Ignacio de Sola Morales sort of created, which is looking at abandoned and unproductive landscapes, and also the term terrain vague. Sorry, that was another term introduced by him, and I created the term slacklands because I was interested in how a lot of these sort of landscapes seemed very sort of leftover, slack, undefined, kind of very loose in their definition. So the first site that I actually photographed was the Torness power station, which is just off the A1, just outside Edinburgh. I'm just getting the archive up now. So I started to categorize the buildings into various categories, which were Cold War military sites, modern follies and religious buildings, functional buildings, and architecture of leisure. So this is the current archive, which includes all buildings from Slacklands 1 and Slacklands 2. So they contrast from, I'm just looking at here, this is St. Peter's Seminary, which is a very well-known ruin. Sorry, just trying to get the image up. Yeah, here, yep, so St. Peter's Seminary, which I think a lot of people know, is just outside Glasgow. It was a Roman Catholic training seminary, which was decommissioned when it was decided that priests should be trained within the community. Just go back to show some of the other ones. This is number 1, the Thames, just off the Thames estuary. Yeah, so I think also it was about collecting these buildings. It was about the context. A lot of the buildings were cited in that particular context because of the landscape. There's the Curtis Dynamite factory, which is in Cliff, just near Gravesend. That is situated on the Hoo Peninsula. It's a factory that was designed to make cordite explosive, which was in operation from about 1870 until the First World War, and then it was decommissioned. And that site has laid vacant since 1920, and now is just used by tenant farmers. It's also the site that was discussed in connection with an airport for London. Sorry, just trying to get an image. Don't seem to have an image at the moment. Yeah, sorry. I think it's frozen. Okay, so yeah, this is the Cliffer Dynamite factory. Yeah, so the Slacklands 2 has about 30 different examples in it. We invited Charles Holland to write the foreword for it, and I'm just going to read a bit from the foreword. He talks about the cult of the ruin is a particularly British obsession, one that can be traced back at least as far as a picturesque tradition of building follies, grottos and ruins in the gardens of country houses. This was in turn influenced by the grand tour and aristocratic experience of the ruins of Greek and Roman culture. Imported back to England, these romantic ruins were underpinned by the spoils of a new mercantile empire. So my first Slacklands book updated this tradition, but with very different protagonists: military, industrial, and municipal buildings from the 20th century. Power stations, factories, jetties, and pillboxes offer a kind of contemporary grand tour, one where obsolescence results from changing technologies, shifts in government policy, and the cross currents of geopolitics. Despite its obsession with the recent past, Slacklands tapped into a very current feeling for the history of ordinary spaces and interest in the previously overlooked corners of our world. So Slacklands is part of a wider project. It's one that challenges traditional notions of beauty and value, a non-aggrandizing form of history that is interested in failure, obsolescence, and even ugliness. And to this, I want to also add, I was very interested in the material nature of the buildings. A lot of them are concrete, and concrete can be seen as one of the materials that is most representative of the Anthropocene. So, this kind of idea of the building eroding and sort of going back into the landscape, I think is interesting in terms of thinking about ideas of deep time. So how we respond to landscapes over much longer periods of time. And I'm just going to show a few images after I close the website of some work by Robert Smithson, who was a sort of early protagonist of ideas around entropy and landscape. So, but also to return to Slacklands, it also acknowledges an important truth about the countryside, which far from being an unspoilt rural Arcadia, is in fact riddled with the detritus of 19th and 20th century technology. So binary oppositions between the urban and the rural often fail to acknowledge the presence of each in the world. It's good to see the ambiguous spaces and places in between celebrated. So yeah, so I think that sort of explains a little bit about the intentions behind Slacklands. And also, I think it was quite exciting to actually, create the publication. I mean, the publication, the first one was partly funded by the Arts Council, and we worked with the designer Carl Narwat, who designed the cover for the first book. I'm just getting, so this is Slacklands 1, just about to, sorry, come up here. Carl Narwat did quite a lot of work for the Architecture Association for various publications. Yeah, so I met at the Copeland Book Fair, which was in Peckham about 7 years ago, the designer Ben Mclaughlin, and Ben was working for a small organization called Preston Is Not My Paris, and they were very interested in kind of disused structures or landscapes of infrastructure. So Ben designed the book, and we commissioned Carl Narwat to do a series of illustrations as well that responded to the buildings. So this is number 1, the Thames, the Grain Tower Battery, and then this is the shark fishery on the Isle of Raasay, which is just off the Isle of Skye. And he's very interested in architecture, and he has quite a sort of playful way of dealing with the kind of typologies of the building. So here he's taken the building, kind of folded it out. So it's a bit like taking a plan and an elevation, but kind of sort of folding it like a piece of kind of fold out model. This is the National Museum of Flight, where he's combined 2 buildings together, and Nissen Hut with a hangar. This is Cope Hill Down, example of a building in Salisbury Plain for fighting in built-up areas. It's supposed to recreate a house in Germany. And then the last is the Apollo Pavilion that he designed And these were all prints that didn't actually, they weren't in the book. It was just the cover that made it into the book, because actually we ran out of time. So just going, yeah. So just go back to the editions. Sorry. And I think, sorry, I have to go to projects. Yeah, so when the Slacklands 1 was launched, we worked together with Margaret Howe, who was a supporter of Open House London. And so we launched the first one there. But also, yeah, I'm kind of exploring ideas about the landscape, and I'm part of the Expanded Territories research group at Westminster University. And one of the sites that I looked at was it was various pillboxes on the Isle of Sheppey. And actually, after spending a bit more time there, working on a residency there, I became very interested in how the whole of the island is constructed. The shoreline is all of London clay, and it's eroding very rapidly. So I started to make castings of the clay to actually create this kind of object a bit like a sort of souvenir, to get them to start thinking about the landscape. So this is, after spending quite a lot of time on the Isle of Sheppey photographing the structures, I started photographing the coastline as well. And there are various other structures on the archive, but I'm not going to attempt to go into it just in case it will, the site goes down. But yeah, I'm now just going to turn to a PDF that I have, see whether I can do that without any hiccups.
I think you just need to stop your sharing and then switch between.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So yeah, just to sort of to recap on what I've said. This is one example from the archive. This is a reconstruction of the German Atlantic Wall. There are two examples of this in the UK, and this one is in Stirlingshire. It's in a very kind of bleak part of Scotland, and it's quite an incredible reconstruction of the wall. The Atlantic Wall was built during the Second World War by the Germans. So it stretches all the way from France to Norway. It's all, the shuttering is corrugated iron. And when you go and visit it, you can see all the kind of bomb damage where they've done the kind of the practice kind of explosives. This is a project where it's kind of extending on from my interest in landscapes. This is where I worked together with an artist, and we started to cast the space of an air raid shelter. Actually, in the shadow of Tate Modern, there's an air raid shelter there. But yeah, I suppose that the classic book that first started to generate this kind of interest in the aesthetic of bunker structures is Paul Virilio's Bunker Archaeology. So this book was published as a catalogue to accompany an exhibition that he did in the museum in Paris, at the Museum of Decorative Arts in 1975. So Paul Virilio kind of walked the coast and kind of photographed all the structures, and the book was published by Princeton University Press, I think about 10 years ago. So, I mean, so bunker archaeology really sort of, I mean, you're probably familiar with it, sort of celebrated the kind of the aesthetic qualities of these structures. And I think it's very interesting. If you revisit some of these structures, you can see how the landscape and the sand has kind of formed great big banks and sort of hidden half of these structures. And along with all the kind of weathering, you start to get the breakdown of the concrete, and the concrete particles, cement starts to kind of merge with the sand. So you get this sort of artificial kind of strata building up around these sites, which is one of the premises discussed within the Anthropocene. This image here is, this is by Ben Mclaughlin, who is the designer of the books and very much the kind of driver behind Slacklands publications. So Ben, as I said, used to work with Preston is My Paris and mass observation, and this is an example of the types of structures that they were very interested in. And I think working with Ben, he published quite a lot of art catalogues, so he had a very strong idea of what kind of publishers that we should use. So we worked with publishers in Holland who produced a very high quality book. I mean, it was quite expensive to print, but I think we always saw it as a very kind of high quality publication, which is using offset prints. So we printed 750 of Slacklands 1, which are now sold out, but we printed 2,000 of Slacklands 2. So a bit more optimistic that we'd be able to sell more. This, interestingly, I'm afraid it's a bit hazy. This was the first illustrator that Ben was quite keen to work with. He was a graduate from the RCA. I actually felt, even though I think they're fantastic illustrations, they were too kind of not abstract enough, not kind of really boring into this idea of, what does it mean to really look at the relationship of the buildings to the landscape, and this idea of the materials kind of breaking down and really getting to grips with the context. I think there was too much of a narrative to these ones. I've put this image on because I think it's very interesting. It was. It's a piece of kind of molten plastic and rock that's kind of melted together. It was actually taken from a beach in Hawaii, Camilo Beach in Hawaii, which is seen as a terminal point in the circulation of waste. So these objects have been labeled plastic agglomerate, and they are credited as being the first objects to actually represent the Anthropocene, and they've been highly collectible because they're very kind of tangible objects that kind of explain, or represent very sort of complex ideas around the Anthropocene. And I think that's, for me, when we came to, Peter will talk a lot more about this, but this is the cover of Slacklands. And I think it was right up until about a week before the book was to go to the publishers, Ben and Peter decided this was a much stronger cover from an early illustration. And I think this kind of represents what we're trying to get across with perhaps a future direction for the book, or really trying to explain the material nature and the landscape of the buildings. Yeah, I mean, I won't talk too much about this, but this is another example of someone theorizing about ideas about aesthetic and the drawscape. This is an image from James Corner and Alex McLean's book, Taking Measures Across the American Landscape, where he photographed the landscape from an airplane, and it's described as the first comprehensive overview of sort of drawscapes, and he breaks down various kind of classifications and creates a sort of taxonomy of these different sites. Yeah, I mentioned that I was very interested in Robert Smithson's writings. You're probably all very familiar with Spiral Jetty. I think Robert Smithson died when he was about 37, but he left behind incredible sort of collection of writings. And this is a picture of him in Dartmoor. He's very interested in the quarries around the southwest of England, the old kind of copper mines. So some of his writings, such as The Monuments of Paisac, which he wrote in 1967, where he's sort of talking about this idea that time, these buildings as they're being constructed are kind of ruins in reverse. So he's kind of playing on themes of time, but encouraging people to think of time as sort of broken up, and kind of celebrating these types of structures. And just to finish on, this is Robert Smithson's Asphalt Pour, So he tipped a whole truck of tarmac onto a site just outside Rome. He was commissioned by an art gallery. And the tarmac kind of represents this kind of layer, another layer on top of the kind of Earth's layer. And I think it was a very early kind of precursor to a lot of what's been discussed now with landscapes. And so in particular, you might be familiar with Gilles Clément's de Borrance Island, which was designed, it's in Lille. It's the Henri Matisse Park. And it's described as a third landscape. And de Borrance is a place in Switzerland which apparently has one of the few primary forests in Europe. So here he's recreating an area for nature which there's no human contact to it. So I mean, that makes me think about quite a few of the sites that I've photographed or started a bit of a relationship to. I mean, this is the Curtis Dynamite factory that I mentioned earlier on. This is in Cliff, just near Gravesend. And it's an incredible site. I'm not sure whether you can see my pointer, but the buildings that you can see, the shells are the old cordite factory units. And within each unit, a tree is kind of cropped up, perfectly situated in almost the same place. And then you have all these kind of rivulets and areas where they test the explosives. So, I mean, this land has been sort of untouched for the last about 80 years, apart from tenant farmers. So the sheep have obviously grazed a lot and to upset the ecology. But I think as a site, it's quite fascinating. And recently, Historic England did a whole survey of it, all about the landscape characteristics of the Hoo Peninsula to make sure that these landscapes are preserved. But interestingly, there was no kind of ecological survey about the site. But for me, in this idea that this site should be just left to be quite unproductive and just kind of mapped would be quite an interesting future for it. So I'm just going to stop there and hand over to Peter.
Thanks, Corinna, and hi everyone. Nice to see friendly faces in the audience. And so I'm just going to share my screen and talk more specifically about Slacklands 2. Okay, I hope everyone can see that. Okay, so yeah, I'm talking about Slacklands 2. So as Corinna said, this was the second book, and I was contacted first of all by Ben Mclaughlin, and he had worked with a designer called James Langdon, who I'm going to talk about in a minute, who's been an important collaborator with me on a previous project. So that was the sort of connective tissue between us. Got in touch with me. So it was a commissioned piece of work, but it really dovetailed with my research and parallel projects that I've been working on to do with architectural sites in the landscape as well. So this is the cover, and I'm going to refer back to this in a moment, this image and what the image was inspired by. But the slideshow I'm going to give, it's going to be a bit of a whistle-stop tour within about 20 minutes. And I'm going to talk in 4 sections. The first is going to be a precedent for the work, a precedent for the project, something I've done before which fed into this. I want to talk about the relationship between the content and the form and the function of a book. So the book as an object and the book as an image relative to what we were trying to do. So that's going to be in a section called Feeds. Then I'm going to do a brief section on some of the processes that went into the making of the work. And then finally, just a tour of the work itself. Okay, so precedents, first of all. So this is just to summarize my practice. I look for ways in which animals, plants, and people navigate each other in degrees of designed space. Projects are collaborative, often with writers, designers, and fabricators, shaping as architectural models, typographic forms, workshop props, and illustrative surfaces. And the word illustrative is is there in the end. I mean, I come from an illustration background. I am an illustrator of sorts. I teach illustration, and perhaps more interested in what illustration could be than often what it is. So this is a precedent. This is a project from around 2014, and it was made in collaboration with James Langdon, who's a graphic designer, writer, and artist, and Gavin Wade, who is a director and curator of a project space in Birmingham called East Side Projects, with whom I had about a 3-year relationship of creating graphic assets, typefaces, artworks for exhibitions and so on. But it had a big influence on the subsequent direction of my work. And I think it's the first project where I concertedly addressed architecture and tried to find a physical grammar that worked for it. So I'm going to read a section from Gavin's text at the back of this user's manual. It's number 6 in a series. So it's a kind of manifesto for the project space and what they were trying to do in the public sphere in the context of Birmingham, but also within the international contemporary art context as well. So I'm going to hopefully run this and it will turn the pages as I talk. So this was done in the form of a story for children. It describes an alternative to the cycle of urban erasure and renewal. That's in the context of Birmingham. In the iconic 1972 publication Ad Hocism, Charles Jenks wrote, "The environment should preserve a record of past action so that present and future actions may be intelligible. In this spirit, Eastside Projects proposes to initiate a new planning policy for Birmingham, informed by values of accumulation, complexity, and storytelling, to make a more legible environment." So, yeah, I think I'll come back to some of the language aspects of that work as I talk about Slacklands too. But essentially, it's a kind of model making process. But rather than there's a sort of stupid trick I try to play with scale, where rather than trying to create scale forms, I find small sort of hand scale forms or book scale forms, which are the equivalent of a larger architectural component or larger architectural motif. So again, here's the front cover of Slacklands 2. And as Corinna said, we came to this, it's probably the last decision we made about the book, to sort of cap it off and to give it a first statement. Obviously the cover is important. But yeah, so these are just some direct influences, and some of these are to do with materiality. I mean, I think we had a lot of conversations about materiality and also about the rendering of materiality in a book so it could find its parallel. This is a sort of 50 centimeter high scroll drawing of 10 images by Wu Bin from 1610, 10 views of a Lingbi stone. So it's a scrutiny of a philosopher's stone rotated from 10 points of view. So it feels like a piece of photogrammetry. And it's always been a really significant image for me. I first saw it in a book about Herzog and de Meuron's models. And the idea that everything is in focus, the image seems to press up against the surface of the page, almost like the epidermis of the page, and comes into contact with your fingers as you handle the book. So it's pressing against the surface of the book as your eyes press back into the book. Again, on materiality, this is an image by the photographer and artist Claude Cahun with their collaborator Marcel Moore from about 1931, 1932. And it's called I Extend My Arms. But I first saw this image. I mean, I've always been interested in Claude Cahun's work, but first saw this image relative to an essay by Amelia Groom, the writer Amelia Groom, in 2017. And I think it perfectly encapsulates a correlation of factual and fictional registers in my work and what we were trying to strike up in the book between Corinna's writing and photographs, and then the function of these images, which start to sort of fictionalize and make poetic some of the examples in the book. So just an excerpt from Amelia Groom's writing. The picture is called I Extend My Arms, but who is the extending I here? Let's see it as a biological, sartorial, geological hybrid whose image extends beyond any of its individual components. The I contains multitudes. Look at the rock which is being worn as a body. It is already also wearing bodies of lichens over its surface, and lichens are themselves zones of hybrid bodies. They're composite creatures who extend across surfaces while growing with an almost lithic slowness. So continuing this theme of being pressed up against the page and pressed up against ultimately the sites that we were talking about. So you have this kind of compression between you and the interface, which is the book. This is Ulysses Carrion, a Mexican conceptual artist that was introduced to me by James Langdon in our conversations about books. And just a short quote from a really wonderful manifesto called The New Art of Making Books, where he says, a book is a sequence of spaces. Each of these spaces is perceived at a different moment. A book is also a sequence of moments. And then just flicking through some other examples of books and book works which talk about themselves reflexively. This is The Carrier Bag Theory of Fiction by Ursula K. Le Guin. It's a very short book, a small book, which incidentally I saw in the AA bookshop recently. I think it's on one of the reading lists, which really excited me. But I've always thought about it from an illustration context. And Ursula K. Le Guin in this book basically talks about the book and the novel as being a container for ideas, a container for imagination rather than a weapon or a tool. So it's the idea of a space within which the author meets the reader, for example, and a democratic space rather than a didactic space. This is a book that probably a number of you know. It's Never Modern by Irene Scalbert and 6A Architects, a collaboration. 6A have always interested me. But this is a particular spread from that book, which talks about the sort of golf club flared terminus at the end of the handrail as you walk into Raven Row. And it was one of those wonderful moments where I read about the intention behind this after I'd experienced walking into the gallery and being kind of stopped by this handrail before I entered into the gallery. So it's a sort of physical experience of content. This is an older book, Design Noir, The Secret Life of Electronic Objects by Anthony Dunn and Fiona Raby. That some of you perhaps know, but there's much that interested me within this book. The image on the cover here is from a section where they created placebo objects and talked about Hertzian space and kind of the imagined impact of these objects. And this is, I think I'm nearly to the end of the books with a couple more examples. This is Horror in Architecture, which I picked up a few years ago. And the sort of visceral accounting for architecture relative to a typology of horror. So it talks about architectural typologies via horror typologies, really helped me to think about the bodily, the visceral, the kind of sweaty aspects of the subject matter that we've been looking at. This is, again, a book that you'll all know, and this was a copy that I was looking at in the British Library, the original edition from 1936, Dorset Shell Guide, compiled by Paul Nash, which is really an ongoing influence for me in terms of the parts of a book which stray beyond expectation and start to become uncanny. I mean, it's a shell guide, it's a tourist guide, but there are aspects, plenty of aspects of this book where it emanates as something it's trying to communicate beyond informational. The strangeness of the book is really important to me. In addition to that book, yeah, there's a very good lecture on the British Art Studies website with a talk and a paper by curator and writer Anna Reid, who writes about Paul Nash's geological enigma. And Corinna and I discussed this sort of towards the latter part of the project, and then towards the publishing of the work. So she says, for example, Nash brings the sublimated or rationally marginalized reality of a colossal geological time. The uncanny of the Dorset Shell Guide derives from the accident of encountering a scintillating geological reel. And finally, another book that's been important for me across the Slacklands book, but also with an ongoing project that focuses on the Norfolk landscape with the Norfolk Broads Authority. This is an image from Rosemary Shirley's Rural Modernity, Everyday Life and Visual Culture, within which she talks about the way that editing out signs of modernity can lead to an aesthetic of rural purity as a form of nationalist identity. These are just 3 site photographs from Norfolk and from my walks, which fed into a project that was running parallel to Slacklands. But I've just got them in here just to reflect a little bit on what Rosemary Shirley says, but also to contrast with the experience of doing Slacklands, which I'm going into here, where for the first time, I wasn't able to physically visit these spaces. I was just working from Corinna's wonderful archive of site photographs for all of these, the sites in focus. So this is the Atlantic Wall, Sheriff Moor, Muir, Dunblane, which Corinna talked about a little bit more before. But the real challenge of the project, and it was a challenge that first of all, yeah, it sort of outfoxed me a little bit, but then I began to embrace, because of the intensity of the photographs, was finding a way to enter into and inhabit these places and scrutinize the photos, so it felt like I could be as much there as possible. This is just quite a straightforward, brisk tour through the methods, and I'll speed up a bit because we're running out of time. So parts of the process were about synthesizing, simplifying, kind of sifting the forms within some of these sites. So for example, the corrugated shuttering that Corinna was talking about, and breaking them down into a series of vector forms on Adobe Illustrator, which were then laser cut and used as press molds. I also set up a kind of parallel archive just to give myself alternative views of the site. So this is from Google Maps, obviously. And also within the photographs, as I started to look at them and look at them again, I wanted to find signs of the contemporary, signs of what these places are like to visit now. So for example, here, the pillbox in a former monastic building in Suffolk, there's an electric fencing system around the site. So I wanted to acknowledge the 21st century within these 20th century and older sites. So for example, that fed into some of the forms. So this was the sort of resourced signage that sat on the electric fencing, and they became motifs within the vocabulary of parts. And this is an object that was developed from that. So yeah, this is the kind of mess within which I work digitally. This is kind of like a flat plan of the book, with lots of possibilities for forms sort of shoved over to the side in a sort of digital scree, and then brought into the page space to think about the scale and how they might work, but always with the option to move things around through the process, which was really important, for example, in my conversations with Ben back and forth. And also the material span of the work had to expand. So I took on some skills, basic metalworking skills, in order to find an equivalent for the kinds of materiality that we were talking about and I was encountering through the photographic archive. Here's some shots of the studio. So you can see that it becomes a kind of hoarder's mess. There's method in the madness, but it gets pretty intense. And then this is the kind of clarity of the spread within the center, just underneath the camera, shot from sort of top down. And then again, an equivalent of the digital scree. This is the kind of physical scree that sort of falls off the edge of the image and then onto the floor. and is yeah, tidied up afterwards over a period of months. And that's an oblique view of one of the compositions, so you have an idea of the sort of dimensionality of the compositions, which is shot from top down. So here are the works, and I can flick through these quicker so that we have time to have a conversation. So it's essentially my sequences sit within the 4 sections of the book, which talk about 4 typologies, breaking down the sites that Corinna is writing about. And it begins with a single page image and ends with a single page image, which are these sort of isolated motifs. And these are like sort of offcuts from the compositions, which are much more intense and compressed. Anyway, you'll see how they work. So I'm not going to say very much through these. I'm just going to flick through them so that you can read them, and then perhaps we can have a conversation. So this starts with Cold War and military sites. And I guess what's obvious as we go through these are that there are registration points across the spread. So this sits across a double page spread, and those hold the eye as other things transition. And each sequence was based on 2 sites, and the sequence was about a sort of mutation from one site to the other. So this is the second section, the second typology, Cold War and military sites. Sorry, I got mixed up there. This is the second section, modern follies and religious buildings. What's apparent, not on this slideshow, but in the book, is that everything is shot scale 1:1. So again, as much as possible, it feels like you are handling the object rather than handling a piece of paper within a book. It looks back at you. This is the third section, functional buildings. And the final section, architecture of leisure. Okay.
Great, thank you so much. They were such beautiful compositions at the end. I think we have a question from Ellis, so I'll go to him.
Thank you, it was wonderful. I was intrigued that Corinna, you referenced Robert Smithson and the Monuments of Passy, where, from memory, I think he's very self-consciously appealing to a picturesque tradition, to the kind of the tradition of sort of 18th century ways of sort of viewing the landscape, and in a sort of ironic way appropriating the way of the kind of empirical way of moving through the landscape from monument to monument. And I just wondered, would you situate this way of looking that you're developing, I mean, it's a question for both of you, within that tradition?
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting question. Yeah, I mean, I know, with that particular project, he went out for this day trip. He bought the New York Times, and he bought a book about science fiction. So he, a bit like the kind of surrealist Derive, he was sort of working through, reading, sorry, I can't remember the name of the science fiction book, but he was kind of layering, these ideas about the future as he walked around. Yeah, I mean, I think my kind of visits to a lot of the buildings have been much kind of more structured. I've kind of, I mean, a lot of the sites well, I suppose I kind of come across them in sort of numerous different ways. I think there's been a lot of fascination with military sites in the UK, whereas, you know, some of the military sites seem extremely kind of very simplistic, such as the V shapes, the roadblocks. So I think to actually, you know, when I've gone out to try and find these sites, it's been very difficult to find them. So you kind of have to use a combination of Google Maps. But yeah, I think once you visit the sites and you start to kind of unravel all these different layers about the kind of context, so it could be about rerouting rivers. So the whole thing becomes a bit more of a kind of assemblage. So from going out to have a look at one building, it starts to kind of unravel a lot of kind of investigation into landscape, into territory, into kind of artificial manipulation of those territories. So yeah, I think probably Robert Smithson was much more, I think a bit more, I don't know, poetic in some ways. And I know that kind of the Monuments Paisac has become such a kind of revered piece of work now. And then there was that work by Tasta Dean. She kind of she went to video Spiral Jetty. So I think, you know, layers and layers of interpretation have been kind of applied to that work. But I think that your question is something I'll probably be useful to kind of mull over. You know, what is my sort of strategy?
I mean, a kind of related question, I guess, is I was intrigued by what you were presenting in the context of the ongoing conversation about rewilding, kind of, you know, existing urban environments, or you know, yeah, often on the urban periphery, and yeah, how the aesthetics of the aesthetic sensibility that you were developing, you know, did that suggest a way of approaching those sorts of real world projects of you know, potentially of kind of returning areas of land to non-human use? You were showing the project, I think, is it the Gilles Clément project? You know, a landscape which is where humans are kind of denied access, and that, yeah, within the current conversation about rewilding, I wondered if that sensibility is going to be, yeah, the conversation you're having kind of has a sort of urgency because of that, perhaps.
Yeah, I mean, I think what was interesting about Smithson is that he started to kind of really grapple with ideas of deep time, and that's a lot of what, you know, conversations about, you know, wilding or rewilding are about. You know, how far back do you go to get to a state of sort of balanced ecology? And then, of course, you know, on top of that comes the kind of aesthetic debate. But yeah, I suppose it kind of differs quite a lot, you know, wilding in the States to kind of the wilding projects in the UK. I mean, I know that the Deborrance project by Gilles Clément wasn't particularly successful with the local people, and part of the project was omitted. They were supposed to have a visitor centre where you could actually have a periscope and actually view, you know, what's happening inside the Deborrance. So that wasn't successful. But I think from a kind of theoretical perspective, it's, you know, amongst the kind of architectural world or landscape architecture world, it's been seen as very interesting because it's allowing unproductivity and, you know, all those kind of ideas of how do we tolerate the aesthetic around that. I don't know whether, Peter, do you want to say anything about that?
Yeah, I mean, the Smithson routing is much more yours than mine. So I'm not so placed to answer it, but I think, yeah, I feel like that the way I inhabited the project is maybe different because it's coming in to your research at a certain point and then carrying in some of my research as well. And I think the reading and the research that I've been doing around, and I don't know whether this is what you mean by aesthetic, but there's a certain way in which the rural is viewed or is permitted to be viewed. And I think what we risked with this book was creating a coffee table book. We, you know, that was there's a lot of very, you know, attractive books about brutalism, for example, and sort of decaying modernist architecture. So, and I think to a certain extent that, you know, the images are, you know, they risk becoming that. But I think there's maybe something that just pulls them away, which allows for, I don't know what the word is. It's you know, acknowledging that we're looking at these sites now, and maybe there isn't so much commodification around the way that we're looking at them. You know, it's about you know, the actuality of them, the strangeness of them, questioning what, you know, what you can and what you can't look at, you know, what you're permitted to look at. I mean, I was, you know, a lot of those thoughts I was having about the Broad's authority and reading David Matlas as well, cultural geography, and I guess my own feeling as I walk through some of these sites, and whether you feel as if you're legitimate. I mean, also, I mean, I'm talking in an architectural context, and there's always a feeling that, you know, how legitimate am I talking about these sites within this context as well? So, but I think that's also the position of an illustrator often, where you're a kind of borrower, or you're a guest, or you're a mediator. So you come into this space in order to offer a different kind of voice to the project as well. That was a bit of a ramble, sorry.
We have a question from Tom McGrath, if you want to ask that, Tom.
Hi, it's a question directly for Peter. Within your pieces, are the components you use that are natural, are they all found objects? So objects you find when on walks or when out in the environment? And how do the connotation of those objects and where they're found feed into the final piece? Yeah, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes total sense. Yeah, thank you, Tom. So the Eastside project was almost completely found. They were found objects, but I think that was somehow, I mean, it was a different stage in my work, but it was also, it lent itself to the kind of architectural grammar that we were talking about in that project. But with this one, I guess there was some luck around the timing, in that the point where the project came to me, when Corinna and Ben came to me, I was walking a lot, having moved from London to Norfolk, and rediscovering what it means to sort of collect from site. So the site-based collected forms are obviously different in nature because they're coming from different places. They're less sort of pre-programmed in terms of what I was looking for. So they're sourced from, you know, a beach or a landscape rather than a pound shop. But also with this particular project, it felt like we needed some kind of underpinning to the images, in the sense that they would hold the eye as you move through the sequences, and some kind of underlying referencing of the structures that sort of sat underneath the lichen and sat underneath the way the landscape had covered them. So there was more of a need for design forms. So the forms that I was drawing on Illustrator are sort of heavily synthesized from looking at cross sections or imagined cross sections of some of the structures, and trying to sort of bring them down into forms on a very sort of simple, blunt grid. And then those were press molded or cut or formed somehow. So they became kind of support structures, almost like you would see a grid or registration marks or sort of chocks or something. They were holders for the more found materials as well. So I think with this project, there was more of a meeting point between found and made, in order to find the right kind of rhythm and the right language for the book.
Great, thank you.
And a question from Victoria Watson, which is for Corinna, I think.
Hello. Yes, my question, it's a very simple question. It's I'm curious to know what Corinna thinks about Peter's illustrations of her archive, or just some insights into what she thinks about her reflections on the illustrations.
Yeah, and a very interesting question. Yeah, I mean, I think I was very keen that Peter should be kind of left to his own devices and not have any interference from myself. So Ben and him had most of the conversations. We had an initial conversation at the beginning where I sort of expressed, you know, where my points of interest were with the buildings, and you know, this interest in the kind of the material nature, the material kind of being an actant, being kind of connected, like an assemblage of different kind of connections. So so what do I think of Peter's illustrations? Yeah, well, I think that they're kind of, you know, for me, I really enjoy, you know, kind of dissecting which parts of the buildings that have sort of come to his notice. So, you know, sometimes I have to work quite hard to actually, you know, think about the different compositions he's created, which buildings they respond to, which kind of layer of interpretation he's kind of plugging into. But I really enjoy, and I think it's something that we all had the intention of, that, you know, within a book, you know, I mean, there's so many architectural books, and I think we're very keen that the book wouldn't just be, you know, attract a kind of architectural audience, because as Peter said, you know, there are many kind of, what's it called, you know, sort of rural kind of brutalism type books. And I think we really enjoy this idea that you kind of punctuate each chapter with something that's quite sort of abstract, and as Peter says, kind of pushes up against your face. So I think, you know, the book is a kind of, has a very nice rhythm to it, and just, you know, you pause and there are about, I think, you know, 6 pages between each chapter. And I think also, I think the cover was very difficult, and I know that at the, you know, the last, I think, as I said, it was just a few days before the book went to the publishers. You know, this very sort of strong, just, you know, one object was decided on, you know, to become the cover. And I think, you know, I was really kind of pleased about that. And I've spoken to people who've been involved in Slacklands 1, and, you know, that's a much more kind of accessible cover. But I think, you know, potentially this cover is a bit more provocative rather than just being an illustration. So you can read it in many different ways. Some people think, oh, that looks a bit like a gun. Some people, you know, for me, it brings back the whole kind of notion about the plastic agglomerate and trying to convey very complex things through quite simple objects or processes. So yeah, I think that's probably my summary of my kind of response.
Okay, and then
Thanks.
just to, can I say some more? Yeah.
Yeah.
Just, would there be some reason, I mean, there must be a good answer to this question, why, I don't want to say it's better or worse, but why you can't interpret the photographs yourself, or the objects that you've collected through, it's your photography, isn't it, I presume? Mm-hmm. So already you're interpreting the things within the landscape and the things within it. But why is that not sufficient? Why do we need an extra layer of interpretation? I mean, maybe we don't need an extra layer. It's a pleasure to make one. I don't know, but I'm just curious as to this constant interpreting that's going on, and to what extent is the interpreting of the actual thing in the landscape through photography, and then again through the production of an artwork where you work collectively with other people to produce these artworks. Does that bring us closer to the thing that, if you like, started this, your sort of instinct to start this process off, or does it take us further away? And again, that's a question I don't expect there probably isn't a good answer to that, but it's just sort of wondering what you think of it.
Yeah, no, I think that's very interesting. You know, like one question that you said, does it bring us closer to the building? I mean, I think, yeah, I mean, there is a lot of photography of, you know, bunkers sort of collapsing into the sea. Yeah, I mean, you know, they are very kind of photogenic sort of buildings or objects to photograph. I think that, you know, there's a book out called The Last Stand, which is all about pillboxes, and particularly in kind of around, you know, coastal areas. But yeah, I mean, I think I'm always interested in working with artists or illustrators, because I just think they bring a different eye to the project. So whether that kind of brings anything extra in terms of a layer of information, yeah, I think I do just like having that kind of expanding it a bit away from just what is, you know, represented through the camera lens, and actually, you know, working with materials. So yeah, I think, you know, it's always an experiment, and it's been interpreted by, you know, in lots of different ways. But I think to try and make the book a bit like a sort of a kind of gallery piece as well. So you're kind of just looking at these illustrations without any text, or you know, that are a bit more abstracted. But no, I think that's a probably ongoing sort of question, you know, because it would be very nice to do a Slacklands 3 where we invite you know, somebody working in a different medium. But whether actually, I mean, hopefully it's just a kind of, it's a provocation beyond what photos could do. I mean, yeah, as I say, it's always a risk. It's always a gamble. Yeah. But yeah, no, I'll definitely keep on thinking about that.
Did you want to add something, Peter?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting set of observations, Victoria, you know, to take away and think about. I mean, it reminds me a little bit of the book was reviewed in The Guardian by, who was it again, Corinna?
Rowan Moore.
Yeah, and there was a section where he talked about whether or not the artworks were necessary. I don't know whether that's quite what you're getting at. I mean, but I think that the points you're making are really interesting, and I think it's something that illustration, you know, the way that illustration is often framed, and the way that it's kind of placed in the scheme of things. I mean, you know, J.D. Salinger famously, I think contractually, in perpetuity, would never have illustrations on his book covers or within the interior. And I think it's a kind of, it's a permanent state of being where illustration, I guess, can feel functionless, or it's referenced as functionless, or it's referenced as something which is perhaps like a bonus or a luxury or ornamental, relative to the essential meaning of a piece of content. But I think it's within that space. That space in itself is really interesting. I mean, it goes back to the Nash. What interests me about the Nash book, which is there is something that kind of is sort of murmuring away, that is beyond, you know, the empirical reading of a text or looking at a site or talking about a site, which starts to scratch away at your imagination, or scratch away at what it means to reflect upon a space, or have a kind of intermission within the reading of a book. There's the Lars von Trier film Breaking the Waves, which has those really odd kind of chapter endings by the painter Per Kirkby, which feel really sentimental in the context of what is a really brutal story. But they start to do something else with your experience of watching that film. So it's yeah, I think it's a really interesting point. But I think it's often the position of illustration in relation to, you know, other pieces of content or pieces of pre-existing content. What is its function, you know?
Yeah, no, it's fine. I enjoyed when you were telling us how you did it. How, I'll just say, an illustrator goes about making some illustration, because as you say, usually it's perceived that illustration is just a sort of a supplement, an extra thing that you put, and nobody's interested in how it arrived. It is just it sort of hides behind the text. I quite like the way that you described structure in your work, the work that you did for that piece. And you talked about how it derived from Corinna's archive, but then you set this project up so it becomes a thing in its own right.
Yeah, I mean, it's a kind of kit. I mean, it goes back to Tom's really interesting question, which is a lot of these forms were collected with no idea that this commission would happen. You know, they find their way into the space. So it's like building, there's a sort of ongoing vocabulary which irrigates projects. but you don't quite know precisely why. A lot of it is about, you know, approximation and then kind of categorizing things. I mean, I store things by color, and where color recurs within the built environment or the natural environment. So I've got a sort of lime green drawer and a sort of brick red drawer of objects. And they in themselves seem to, you know, the color end of the palette seems to talk already about the meeting point between the synthetic and the natural, or when something appears to be invasive or foreign or not, all those kind of dialogues about what you should and shouldn't see within these spaces. So the palette is kind of already there. And when we first met, we had a really wonderful conversation, and I always learned something from coming away from the conversations with Corinna. But what I tend to do is to lay out a set of sort of sub-assemblies, a set of part-made forms, you know, photographs of those forms, with an idea of how this thing could start to build, rather than sort of trying to describe it all verbally. So it starts off as a physical conversation pretty much from the get-go, yeah.